Tim McGrew, who is not only our faculty advisor, but a pretty well-known apologist, especially among the internet crowd that's having contact with him on a regular basis. So he's also the chair of the philosophy department, PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt University, and if you want to know more about him, you can ask him afterward. So I'll leave it at that, and take it away, Tim.
Thanks very much, John. Appreciate that I see some of you here who aren't always here. Thank you for coming out. What you didn't realize is that you are now going to be used as guinea pigs. Because this talk is one that I haven't given before, and as you might have seen, I was scrambling to complete another segment of it in the last few minutes while John was starting announcements up here. So, for all typographical errors and other bits of craziness that may have crept into the PowerPoint, I apologize in advance. And there is so much to this topic that I cannot possibly cover even a modest percentage of it. It's really a vast topic. However, I was motivated to put something together for you because during the course of the debate, John Loftus, on one of his sort of random shots, took aim at the argument for prophecy even though Abdu Murray had not brought it up. And he said a couple of things in passing that might have sounded plausible to those who haven't made any study of it. So I thought it would be appropriate here the week after the debate to revisit the topic and draw specific attention to John's kinds of criticisms and look at the argument in detail and ask whether those criticisms can be sustained. So, without further ado, I will launch into this discussion. Let's see. Do I have a dual view? I guess I don't. Here. Okay. Well, you see what I see. I always like to start these talks out with an epigraph. And in this case, what better epigraph than 2 Peter 1:19? And we have the prophetic word more fully confirmed, to which you would do well to pay attention as to a lamp shining in a dark place. By the time that we're done this evening, I hope you understand why I chose that verse for our epigraph. Prophets, what do they do all day? What's their job? Sit around and write parts of the Bible? Is that what their gig is? We tend to focus a lot on prediction, and tonight I will focus on that. But before we do that, we need to remember that their job was to speak the Word of God, and this included moral and ethical teaching, confrontation when necessary, condemnation when necessary. Predicting the future is only one and perhaps relatively small part of a prophet's job. It's there, but it's not the main thing. The main thing is to speak the word of the Lord. And indeed, we've got prophets in the Old Testament who scarcely ever or maybe never make predictions. Can anybody think of a prediction made by Elisha? I'm blanking too. Okay? If there is one, there aren't very many. So, forthtelling, telling out the Word of God rather than just foretelling. When they did foretell events, it wasn't for the benefit of the people who were there immediately to hear the prophecy. Why? What if I say to you right now, the Broncos will win the next Super Bowl? You heard me say it. You may think I'm varying shades of crazy, right? Didn't I hear who just retired? But can you tell whether I'm right or wrong right now, here? Not for sure. You may have your own shrewd guess, but you can't be certain whether what I've said is true or false. And therefore, as evidence to you of my foresight, it's worthless. When they tell the future, it's for the benefit of people who can tell whether the prediction will come true, whether it has come true, actually. So the evidential value of predictive prophecy is all for those who live in a time, be that soon or late, when they can see whether it has been fulfilled. This is an important point. because it makes prophecy very special and different from the working of a visible miracle. If you hand me a glass of water and I pray over it and hand it back to you and it's wine, the miracle's right there in front of you. Right there, on the spot. You may have not the faintest clue how I did it, but there it is. Somebody 75 years later has to hear about that by being told. Can't see it the way you see it. So, the evidence for the working of physical miracles is one that has to be passed on by testimony. Now, some people think testimony is a terrible way to pass it on. I think often that's much too skeptical. We can talk about that if you like. But prophecy is different. Because there's nothing supernatural about someone's saying certain words and having them written down. And we have really excellent records of when some of these things were first uttered and first written down. And they may be about something which is not a supernatural event, like the Broncos winning a Super Bowl. Not a miracle. Doesn't require an act of God for that to happen. Your mileage may vary. But, yeah, what if I said Detroit Lions? Would that make a true miracle? Yeah, all right, yeah, now we're talking act of God. But it's the correspondence between the two that constitutes the miracle. Not that somebody said something, not that something happened, but that the two of them connected, lined up. So the specific parts of the miracle are not kinds of things that are themselves supernatural. It's the correspondence between them. So predictive prophecy, in particular, I'm going to give a definition and then we'll see why this matters, is the description of persons or events so far in advance of their coming into existence and with such accuracy and fullness that neither blind guessing nor merely human foresight can explain how it came to be foretold. Important point. We may need to ask whether something fits this description with regard to a pattern. It's easy to take a case that's built up out of numerous particulars and isolate each one and then say, well, that one's not very strong by itself, and this one's not very strong by itself. How many of you have ever seen the kind of rope that sailors call a hawser rope for mooring a large ship? Big, fat ropes. Really strong. Braided and twisted together of hundreds of thousands of fibers at every point. If I were to take one of those vast hawsers and I were to pick it apart, one little filament at a time, thousands upon thousands of them, and then I were to pick each one up and say, this isn't very strong, see, I can break it. And that one's not very strong, I can break that too. And piece by piece by piece, say the little parts of this aren't very strong, would it follow that the whole hawser rope isn't very strong? No, idiotic suggestion. And so it is with a cumulative argument, whether we're making it in history, or in law, or in considering the argument for prophecy. Just because this or that bit can be picked apart, it does not follow that the argument as a whole is weak. So we may need to look, and in fact, in many cases, it's best to look for a pattern and not to try to rest the whole case on this one particular verse right here. We'll see this over and over. I hope to illustrate this for you extensively tonight. So even though I was putting together pieces of this at the last moment, we might actually make it all the way to 8:30 before I run out of stuff to say. That's also partly because I'm a professor, so I talk professionally. All right. How does this work as evidence? As we said, the purpose is not to give the original audience a schedule of coming events. It's not like an almanac. Instead, it's to give evidence visible only after the event that the event itself was part of God's plan all along. Here's a metaphor that I like. I've picked this up from other authors. I don't even know who the first author was to bring it out. The statement of the prophecy is like a lock. The subsequent history provides the key to the lock, and nothing else does. What this means is that it's not required for a prophecy that it be clear in advance. In fact, sometimes it needs to not be clear in advance. How's that for a weird-sounding statement? Notice what Jesus says in John 14. Now I have told you before it takes place, so that when it does take place, you might believe. He's referring to his departure, to his going back to the Father. And he says, I'm telling you this now. Then later when it happens, you'll get it. You'll know. You'll understand. Why should we study the argument from prophecy? There are many other arguments. In fact, I've got a set of 10 of them that I've been going through with our Ratio Christi leadership team. And we have little mnemonics for them, and we're lining up. This is just one of the 10 points. Maybe we could just do without it. Well, you can, in the sense that the doctrine police don't come along and handcuff you and cart you away if you don't make a study of it. However, it's the main argument to which Jesus himself appeals. Remember the road to Emmaus and then the subsequent interview of Jesus with his disciples gathered together? On the road to Emmaus, what does he say? Oh, foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So Jesus, as he's portrayed to us in the Gospels, said, everything from Moses through the prophets pertains to me. Let me show you thing after thing after thing, and unfolded all of this to them. And again, a little later in the same chapter, then he said to them, his disciples, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. So, Jesus, as Luke is telling us, claims that in Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms, there's stuff about him that has to happen. Now you say, that's fine, but this could all be what they call retconning, sort of retroactively trying to fit it all together. Wait and see. Hold that hypothesis in your mind. Be willing to entertain it as a skeptical hypothesis. See if that's actually going to fit the data that we come up with. Not only Jesus appealed to predictive prophecy, the apostles appealed to it in order to convince their fellow Jews. And what argument better to convince the Jews than from their own scriptures? So, let's see some examples of this. Chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter. I could keep going about a dozen times of the book of Acts. What do you find in Acts chapter 2? Peter at Pentecost, appealing to prophecy. Acts chapter 3, Peter and John in Solomon's porch. Acts chapter 4, they're before the Sanhedrin. Acts chapter 7, Stephen's defense before the high priest. Acts chapter 8, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. What's the Ethiopian eunuch reading? Isaiah 53. And Philip says, you understand what you're reading? What a great opening line. No, how could I unless somebody helps me? Hold that thought. The Ethiopian eunuch is reading Isaiah 53 and he's puzzled. Have you ever tried to read Isaiah 53 just to see whether it's puzzling? This is hard to do because you have to take out of your mind the fact that you know the New Testament and just read it as it stands. There are some baffling features in Isaiah 53. There are baffling features in Psalm 22. We'll look at them both in detail. Acts chapter 9. Paul, what did he do when he was converted? He was confounding the Jews at Damascus, proving that this is truly the Christ. How do you think he did that? What does Christ mean? Anointed one. It's the Greek term used to translate the Hebrew Mashiach for Messiah. This is the one. This is the one promised. Paul said, and confounded the Jews at Damascus, arguing from their own scriptures because there is no other way to make that case. And see also Acts chapters 10, 13, 15, 17, 18, 28. It's all over the place. You can't get away from the fact that this was a primary point in the apostolic promulgation of Christianity, telling people why they should accept him. The other major point was that he rose from the dead, and we're all witnesses of it. Those two lines of argument are the first and fundamental arguments for the truth of Christianity. And that's why it's really a good idea for us to get a grip on both of them. We heard in the debate a concise presentation of some of the evidence for the resurrection. There's more to say about that, and Abdu knows it. Trust me. John and Abdu and I got together Monday night before the debate and went over his case, and he asked us questions about how to do certain things or what we thought of certain points, and we gave him advice on it, and he used some of it in the debate, which was great. But there's way more, and he had way more with him. Did you see that white binder he was carrying around? Yeah. That was full of extra data and evidence, and in that white binder, he had everything separated out with tabs, with like keywords written on the tabs so he could flip to the right stuff really quickly. He's a well-organized guy, much more organized than I am. I loved it. Okay, before we get into the argument, let's think about some worries. I don't want you to go out of here saying, well, I heard the argument for it, but I don't know, maybe somebody could come along and say something plausible against it. Let's get that right out into the open, and then you can have these skeptical challenges and worries in mind as we look at the specific evidence. So let's not hide the elephant. Let me introduce the elephant. In fact, 4 elephants. First worry. Is the prophecy so specific and its fulfillment so full that their match cannot be explained away as a mere accident? Is it really that close of a match? Ever read fortune cookies to your friends when you're at a Chinese restaurant? Of the many complaints that we have about the fortunes on fortune cookies, what's one of the most common ones? Changes will come into your life.
Very vague statements.
Really vague. Tell me what would not count as a fulfillment of that one. They're so vague that we laugh, actually. We don't even wonder. We know that any correspondence between the fortune on the fortune cookie and our lives is a function of the fact that it's so vague it can be taken as applying to all kinds of things. So there's a worry. Deliberate ambiguity in a prophecy was a feature of the Greek oracle at Delphi. If you cross this river, the oracle at Delphi says to a king who's wondering if he should go to battle, a great kingdom will be destroyed. Right. Guess which one he thought was going to be destroyed. Guess which one was actually destroyed. So, vagueness or ambiguity in the statement can be a source of worry. It might be that the correspondences are just accidents or things that we're seeing like you see a butterfly in an ink blot or something. It's something you bring to it rather than something that's actually there. That's a worry. Were the events really too hard for someone to foresee or guess? In 1935, Winston Churchill said, Europe is headed for a disastrous war. 5 years later, we were at war, and the greatest of all wars we have ever seen. Was he a prophet?
Probably.
Okay, he was a very great man, and yet, this is not something that lies utterly beyond the reach of human foresight. A combination of shrewdness and maybe a little bit of luck, and we're there. I could give you other examples of people guessing. We want to make sure that if we're going to appeal to prophecy, it's not just something that somebody could do a lucky one-off and like, oh yeah, jackpot, I got that one right. Were the original texts really written long before the events that fulfilled them? The skeptic Porphyry, 3rd century A.D., said that the Jewish prophecies about the kingdoms that would rise, that you remember Daniel's prophecy of the various kingdoms, right? The gold and bronze and iron and clay in the statue. They were so specific that they clearly matched actual historical events, and therefore, what do you think he concluded? It must have been written after the events, because nobody could get it that good before the events. I don't happen to think Porphyry is right about that, and I think we can make an argument, but it's an argument that would have to be made. If somebody's going to say, no, that was actually written after the events, and so there's no wonder that it matches up that well, it's writing as history, not as prophecy, then we have to make a different kind of argument. I'm not averse to making that argument, but the stuff we're going to look at tonight, that cannot apply, as you will see. Finally, here's the last worry, and this was a really important one. Could someone who knew about the prophecy have acted out a part to trick people, making it look like it had been fulfilled? We can imagine predictions that might be made where somebody might come along and say, if I play a certain part and I do it just right, I can look like I'm the fulfillment of the prediction. Sweet gig if there's something good that's supposed to come along with it, like wealth and power and fame. So we need to think about the question, could somebody who knew about the prophecy have acted out a part to trick people? There is an important corollary to this. One of the objections against prophecy is that it's too plain and clear and straightforward and must therefore have been written after the event. Another is that it's too vague and therefore must not really correspond to the event because it wasn't much of a prediction in the first place. It might occur to you that between those two kinds of criticism, we're almost caught in a heads I win, tails you lose kind of situation, right? If it's too plain, they'll write it off. If it's too vague, they'll write it off. How could you, if you actually knew the future and you wanted to set up a prophecy so that after the fact people could see it had been fulfilled, how could you give the prophecy in such a way as to block strategy 4 here, problem number 4, from happening? How could you do it?
Make whatever was to come something no one wanted to do.
You could make it something nobody would want to do. That would be one thing. That's a way to do it. You could leave the hints, but laid out in such a way that you couldn't really tell what they meant until after the fact. Can we sometimes tell after the fact that something took place, even though beforehand, we couldn't tell what it was going to be from the prophecy? Sure. We have examples of this. We have examples in ciphers. I show you a jumbled mass of what looks like alphabet soup lined up. And you say, for all I can tell, you were playing with your alphabet soup and spooned out some random letters and set them out in a row here. I don't have any idea why that should be anything. And then I give you a key to the cipher. And I say, move backwards one letter from each of these letters and see if a pattern emerges. And there's this complete intelligible sentence, and suddenly you realize, yeah, that was there all along. This is not chance. This is not random. Or suppose I tell you a funny story. Jonathan Swift has a story called A Tale of a Tub. Any English majors in here who have read Swift's Tale of a Tub? Great! Excellent, then I can use it for this example. It's a story of 3 brothers, all of whom inherit these valuable robes from their father. But the robes have all these metal fastenings that clink and are heavy and awkward all over them. And so one of the brothers just says, I can't stand all that extra stuff, and he rips all of them out. This tears up the garment somewhat, but he's rid of all of these things festooned to it. Another brother says, I'm not going to do that, and he leaves all of this clunky stuff all over the garment. A third brother says, I think I could get some of these out without damaging the garment, and the ones that I can't, I'm just going to leave. What's that about? It's Jonathan Swift. He writes satires. He probably has something in mind, right? But what is it? Anybody sure of what it means without looking it up on your computers now? Tut-tut. If you're not sure now what it means, does that mean that if I tell you what he's doing, you won't be able to tell if my explanation is a plausible one? He's writing a satire on church history. The robes are the forms of worship. All the clunky, cluttery, clanky stuff on them are things that have been accrued to the Roman Catholic way of doing worship. Brother John is John Calvin, who rips all of them out of the garment, leaving some rents in the garment. Brother Martin is Martin Luther, who gets rid of the ones that he can, and then the other stuff he just leaves there, and he doesn't try to tear them out by force. Okay, and Brother Peter, of course, just leaves all the stuff on. And now it's perfectly plain. You can see where he's going, you can see what he's doing, but I had to give you the interpretation before you could see, oh, that's a social satire on church history, and that's where he's going. And now all is plain. We can sometimes see plainly and not be fooling ourselves or thinking it, of it accidentally. We can see plainly what the meaning is, but only if it's set out in such a way as to require us to get the key for the lock before we can open the lock. To require the history to lay it out for us, and then we can see it. Now, there's still a worry here that we'll trick ourselves, that we will see patterns that are not really there. So as we go through this, keep that worry in mind and ask yourself, the pattern that's emerging here, how detailed is it? How specific is it? Could I just actually be reading into the text and not really have it being there? Ask yourself this. Because John Loftus wants to tell you that's exactly what you're doing. You're reading into it. There are many lines of Old Testament prophecy, and I don't have time to go through them all. So I thought I would just talk about 3. I'm going to talk about the prediction of the coming Messiah. This is very, very important in Judaism. There is no other national literature stretched out over many centuries, all from beginning to end, woven together with this theme of a coming Messiah. From Genesis to Malachi, and it just incidentally happens that most scholars think Malachi was the very last book to be written. Not all of the rest of them are in chronological order, but it just happens that Malachi probably was last. From Genesis to Malachi, we have this theme of the coming of the Messiah. We'll take a quick look at that. Psalm 22, a psalm of lament, even a psalm of sobs from someone who is suffering. Loftus said, that's just about David. It's just about the psalmist. It's not about Jesus. Hold that thought. We'll look at it. We'll see if he's right. And the most famous passage of all time for prophecy, Isaiah 53, or more strictly, the last few verses of Isaiah 52, and then Isaiah 53. These lines of prophecy are worth your time to master. There are things worth putting in memory effort for, so that you don't always have to be saying, well, there's this YouTube video somewhere I could go look up. Some of these things you will want to have in the front of your mind and not be scrambling around if somebody asks you, why do you think there's prophecy in the Old Testament? I mean, these are just sort of crude goat herds who had some weird ideas and they wrote some books, but the books don't really connect in any meaningful way. This is sort of random stuff. Why are you all hung up on saying it's a prediction of the future? You want details at that point. You don't want vague impressions. Vague impressions don't keep a conversation going. How many of you have something you can write with at this point? Only a few. Okay. I encourage you to pull things out and actually take some notes here. For one thing, if you have questions about this toward the end, we can come back and you can ask them very specifically about particular points. Share paper and pens with one another if you need to. If anybody's really dying for a pen, I have some. All right. There are some features of these prophecies that I'm going to draw your attention to as we come along. Anybody need, Ross, I think it's extra paper. Anybody need extra paper? We're passing it around back there. This is all good. Pens? Do we need pens? Look, I'm a geek. I have pens. You need pen and paper? You got it. You're all set. All right. Beautiful. Some features of these prophecies we're going to see coming up again and again. Most of them are direct and obviously intended as predictive from the context, but some start out sounding like they might be intended of somebody contemporary with the author, maybe the author himself. But then they go off in a direction that cannot possibly be applied to anyone then living. Watch for that. In Psalm 22, keep your eye on the ball. It starts out, you're like reading verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, and you're saying, yeah, this could just be like a lament of David, he's in trouble, things are going wrong, where is God? And it sounds like that, and then it turns off into places where we cannot anymore pin it on David or anybody else. That's a striking fact. Keep your eye on that. Third feature, and this comes up very strongly in Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. These passages and many others contain things that are paradoxes. There is no obvious way from them to invent a story that plausibly fulfills them. You're stuck right there because it's just not at all clear how these could be true of the same person. History unlocks that lock for us. But before you see the history, it's incredibly difficult to write this up. And this is important. Some people would like to say the stories that we have in the Gospels are imaginative fictions derived from the prophecies of the Old Testament, designed to weave those prophecies together into a plausible sounding story. There are a lot of reasons that hypothesis won't outlive a close confrontation with the facts. Let me give you just one example. There's a very famous verse in Isaiah 7, Isaiah 7:14. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bring forth a son. It's even quoted in Matthew 1, right? Now, what's a plausible sounding skeptical hypothesis? Well, Matthew, or whoever wrote the first gospel, was reading along in Isaiah, saw this messianic prophecy. Messiah is going to be born of a virgin. Hey, what a great idea. Let's write up a story about Jesus. Maybe he was a real guy, but just didn't have all these other things happen to him. Let's write up a story about him and say that he was born of a virgin. Then it will match the prophecy of what the Messiah is supposed to be like. Sounds like a plan, right? There's a small problem with this plan. We have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of writings from the Jews about messianic prophecy in their own scriptures. And nowhere in any of that does anyone ever take Isaiah 7:14 to be a messianic prophecy. If you're a Jew looking for messianic prophecies to use as a basis for this novel you're working on about Jesus, that one's not going to come up. And I know this because I have books with me. And Michelle likes me better now that she's seen the books because she's a librarian. This is volume 2 of Alfred Edersheim's book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. And he has an appendix in which he goes through all of the passages that the Jews themselves took to be prophecy. And on page 727 of volume 2 of Edersheim, there's a discussion of Isaiah 53. And then if you flip back a little bit, there's a discussion of Isaiah 7. And you realize, actually, there's not a discussion of Isaiah 7 because it's not one of the ones that they considered. It skips over Isaiah 7. So that's the beautiful thing about having all these old books. John and I are engaged on a project, and many of you know about this project, of putting together numerous sources for online study. And this includes criticisms of Christianity, criticisms of other religions, criticisms of miracle claims, criticisms of prophecy, and defenses. And we have thousands of volumes these little friends I brought with me here are just a small sample of the material that we have on this. This is not something we're making it up. This is not something where we are trying to figure out how this could all go on our own. We have people who have gone before us and done vast quantities of work. So this work that we're doing for the Templeton Foundation is making us very familiar with all these different points about the arguments back and forth. So I've made these claims about Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. But let's start with the prophecies of the Messiah. The really interesting thing about this, and as I said, this is unparalleled in any other national literature anywhere, is that across centuries, from many different authors, you've got these promises of Messiah, and they become more and more and more specific. You might worry that that's because it was becoming clearer and clearer and clearer how they were going to be fulfilled, except that it wasn't at all becoming clear. The prophecies are like concentric circles. They're narrowing it down, but there was nothing in the history of the times that would give an impulse to that narrowing down of the prophecies. So, Genesis 12 and 18 and 22. All nations are going to be blessed in Abraham's offspring. His descendants will bless all nations. How? It doesn't say. If we took that one alone, and I said to you, well, Jesus was a Jew, hence a descendant of Abraham, and all nations have been blessed in him, you might say, maybe, but that's not terribly specific. That could be an accident. And you're right. By itself, it could be. But it isn't by itself. We go further. We advance a little further. Genesis 26 tells us specifically it's going to be through the descendants of Isaac. Genesis 28 says through Jacob. Okay, but still, Jacob's other name was Israel, and they're still all Jews, right? Yeah, but then it gets more specific. Genesis 49, it's going to be through the tribe of Judah. The scepter will not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. Shiloh. Same root that we have in Jerusalem, city of God's peace. Shiloh, peace. Somehow, peace is to come, and the scepter won't depart from Judah until then. Okay, still a little unclear what that means. But wait, Psalm 72 says specifically it's going to come through David's son Solomon. Whoa, now we're down to the line of David, and one particular son. He had a lot of sons, you know. But now we're focusing on his son Solomon. Well, you say, okay, but maybe that psalm was written after Solomon's glory had become famous, maybe even after his death. How many kings did Israel have as a united nation? 3. Saul, David, Solomon, and it all falls apart. Read it sometime. Those are those long historical books that we treat as flyover territory when we're preaching, right? After the severance of the northern and the southern kingdoms, there was little reason to hope for anything glorious from the line of David or of Solomon. Oh yeah, Micah tells us he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Daniel 9 tells us he'll fulfill his mission after 69 and a half sevens. Sevens, oh, that must mean days. Actually, the context of the prophecy makes it perfectly plain. It can't mean days, and this is the exact same phrase that is used elsewhere in the giving of the law, for example, to talk about 7-year periods. So, the year of Jubilee comes after 7 sevens. What's that? That's 7 periods of 7 years. After 49 years comes the year of Jubilee. So reading 7 in Daniel 9 as years isn't something that Christians do to try to shoehorn it in. It's something that's actually the way the word is used elsewhere in the Old Testament, uncontroversially. So what do we have here? We have a promise to Abraham, specifically about Isaac, more specifically through Isaac's son Jacob, still more through the tribe of Judah, and through the line of David and David's son Solomon, born in Bethlehem, the city of David, and at a time that is to take place after a certain number of years following the order to rebuild Jerusalem. You've got to read Daniel 9 for yourself. It was one of the things I considered going through here. I didn't have time to do it in detail. It's quite fascinating. Now, there's a skeptical school of thought about the book of Daniel that says the book of Daniel, because it contains prophecies that are so good, was written after, or at least during, the Antiochian period in the 180s, 170s BC. I'm not impressed with the arguments, but for the sake of argument, let's suppose that it were. That's still more than 200 years before Jesus enters upon his public ministry. You think I'm bold if I say the Detroit Lions are going to win the Super Bowl. What if I told you who's going to win the Super Bowl 2 centuries from now? Will there even be a Super Bowl? I don't know. That's a hard call. As a nation, we've only been around a little more than 200 years. That's looking that far in the future. Hello? Really? So there's a set of concentric circles here, narrowing it down, but without anything in the history of Israel to give you particular hope. In fact, born in the city of David, by the time Micah is writing, why should we hope or believe that this is ever going to get pulled together again so that any descendant of David will do anything? Well, we might look at history and we might say, sons of great rulers are often great rulers. They often inherit a kingdom. How'd that work out for the pharaohs? You might have noticed that the descendants of the pharaohs are not reigning in Egypt anymore. In fact, there's a prophecy about that in Ezekiel. That's another one that I thought of including, and there's not time to talk about it. Even plausible-sounding predictions that certain people will still be in positions of power many generations later often just fall apart. History is unkind to predictions like that. How about if then you take somebody who is from a house whose star has already set? They've already fallen out of power and prestige and are now humble, and he's got somebody from that group that's going to do it. Really? Would you predict that about somebody who is the son of gypsies? Would that be a smart move? You might accidentally be right. Probably not. So much for the catna of prophecies of the Messiah. Now we're going to get into the Isaiah passage, and this one is intense. So hold on. If you have a Bible or a cell phone, then this would be a good time to pull it out. We're going to do Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, verse by verse. If I could do it, I would tell you that there would be a quiz, because I want you to pay attention to this. And what I want you to be asking yourself is not, this one particular verse, if it were totally isolated, would that prove the whole case? Instead, I want you to ask, are there enough correspondences here, enough points in the pattern, that this would really not be the kind of thing that would just happen by chance? Are these things the kinds of things that somebody who is audacious and daring might set out to make himself fulfill, to trick us all? Is that plausible? Ask yourself this as we go through, point by point. We're going to start with 52:13. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. Okay. So far, we have no idea who that is. Somebody's going to be acting wisely and he's going to be lifted up and exalted. Good for him, right? Who's that guy? Well, the Jews knew until it became a problem for them because this passage was being used by the Christians over and over and over. And so in their own targums, their own paraphrases on their scriptures, the paraphrase in the Targum of Onkelos reads, "Behold, my servant, the Messiah, shall deal prudently." Not, as John Loftus told us, the nation of Israel. No, that wasn't their original reading of their own scriptures. That's the reading they reverted to when it became difficult to stop the Christians in their argument using this passage. I am told, I haven't checked this out, that in the daily series of readings from Tanakh, there are readings from Isaiah, but not this chapter. This chapter has been taken out of the circulation of daily readings. I would like to know if that's true, but I haven't yet confirmed it. But what if we think of this reading backwards? Certainly, the excellence of Christ's teaching and conduct is widely admitted, even by enemies of Christianity. I can give you quotations from Ansfrenon or from Lecky, and he's worshipped by many millions, so we could say there's a correspondence there. And yet, by itself, that wouldn't be strong enough for us to say, it's not chance. Maybe that's chance, but that's one dot. How many of you have seen an impressionistic painting? It's made up of thousands of little dots of color. And any given dot is just a dot of color. But what happens when you step back from it? You see more than just this, that, and the other dot of color. They make a pattern. When I was in college, I had some friends, fellow students, who had us over to their home, Spanish background, and their father was a fantastically gifted painter. Unbelievably talented. And he was doing a whole series of paintings on the creation of the world. And he was one of these wonderful, warm people who you just love the minute you meet him. He and his wife both. Jorge Pinaros. He had one painting off by itself. The thing must have been 7 or 8 feet high. And when you walked up to it and looked at it, it was this black and gray tangled mass of thorns, and the individual thorns were visible throughout it, and they just wove in and out of one another all through the picture. The whole thing was very dark, and it looked like your nightmare of the woods you can't get out of because your path is blocked by these hedges of thorns in all directions. It was really very grim looking. And as long as you stayed up close to it, looking at it, you could look at any part of the picture, and that's all that you would see. But if you took 3 or 4 steps back and you looked at it from a little distance, suddenly, the whole picture would change. And what you saw woven in and out from those thorns and the blackness was the scarred and bleeding face of Christ. Unmistakable. Once you saw it, you could not unsee it. But until you saw it, you didn't know what you were looking at. I'm told, and I do well believe it, that somehow someone from the Smithsonian found out about this painting and came to Jorge's house. Looked at it, realized what he had done, took out a checkbook, and wrote out a 6-figure check and said, "I want this." What do you think he did? He tore it out and he threw it in his face. Money! You're going to give me money for this? This is my Christ. I tell you, if a barefoot beggar had walked into his house and fallen down weeping before that picture, he would have rolled it up and given it to him for nothing. But not a few $100,000. pattern was everything. Not this or that thorn, but the pattern. Keep going. Verse 14. As many were astonished at you. His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. Now, what can we think of there? What does that suggest to you? At the time of Christ's death, which was in public, so that many saw him, the cruel treatment he had received had disfigured his face and body. They had torn out his beard, flogged him. If you've never seen the scars left by a flogging like that, you should look them up online. I'm not going to disturb you with the images now, but you might want, when you're in a mind to have that kind of fortitude, you might want to look them up yourselves. But many were astonished at him and at his marred appearance. Next verse. So shall he sprinkle many nations. What is sprinkling in a Jewish context? It's part of the round of sacrifices for atonement. They're not going to miss that one. This has something to do with atonement. But who's he going to atone for? Well, just the Jews, right? No. Many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. Which kings? Kings of Israel? No, for that which has not been told them, they see. And that which they have not heard, they understand. They're not the people to whom it was told. They're not the people who had heard it first. But they will see it and they will understand. Even now, kings are silent. Silence, probably indicating reverence. There's a cross-reference there to Job if you're interested. Contemplating what they are told of him, bringing them understanding they have never before heard. Another dot in the pattern, another thorn in the picture, weaving in and out. Let's move on to the next verse. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? What he's about to declare is so marvelous it can hardly be believed. It has to do with a marvelous act of God for his people. And this has already been introduced earlier in chapter 52. The Lord has bared his holy arm. What does that suggest? That's some kind of instrument or maybe a person by whom God will accomplish his will, the way that a man might use his arm to accomplish his will. Moving to the second verse of Isaiah 53. For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of a dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. Nazareth, just for the record, was widely regarded as an unpromising place for anything good to come out. Do you remember what Nathanael says when they say, "Come and see this man. We found the Messiah. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" You're kidding me. There's a story that Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells about the time of Herod the Great, Herod the baby killer. His wife Miriam's brother, I believe, was so handsome that the population just adored him. And so they made him a priest, and as he came by in his priestly robes, everybody thought, wow, this guy cuts a great figure, and he's related to Herod's wife. This is so awesome. Herod got jealous about it and had him, I think, drowned in a pool.
Sorry.
I mean, life is hard. Herod did all kinds of crazy things. The guy was beyond paranoid. He makes paranoid look pale. At his own death, when he knew he was dying, he said, call all the chief men from all throughout the land and assemble them all in one place. So they got them all into this place called the Hippodrome, and they locked the doors. And he said, the hour that I die, station archers on the balcony above and shoot them all and kill them all. That way at my death there will be a great mourning, because otherwise nobody's going to mourn at my death. It's just got a little bit loco. Yeah. When he died, they promised him they'd do it, and then when he died they were like, yeah, no, and they let them all go. It's all in Josephus. Got to read this stuff. His appearance, perhaps his physical appearance, perhaps also his station in society, was humble. It was not calculated to attract the desire and praise of men. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. How about Jesus? You don't really need the specific line in John's Gospel to know that what he's saying is true. He came to his own people, and they didn't receive him. Even when Pilate offered to release him, the rulers of the Jews and those with him cried out against him. There's plenty in the Gospels about his sorrows, but I'm not including that here. Because somebody might say, well, somebody could sort of put on a sad face in order to make it look like he was fulfilling one bit of the prophecy. There's plenty of stuff here he can't fulfill by himself. It's not up to him. Surely, he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Wait, stop. If we esteem him smitten by God, then we must be people who know about God, right? Who does that make us? Makes us Jews. But then he's being stricken for our sins, and we're the Jewish people. Can he also be the Jewish people personified? This is not going to work. Sorry, Mr. Loftus. This is not going to work. Although he somehow took our griefs and sorrows as his own, his death was that of a criminal, one that the Jews would take as a sign of a curse from God. There's a passage in Deuteronomy 21 that said everyone who's hung on a tree is accursed. And once crucifixion came to be a punishment that the Romans were doling out, the Jews immediately applied it to crucifixion. How about verse 5? But he was pierced. If you're working with the King James and it says wounded, the term is more specific. It's pierced. For our transgressions he was crushed. For our iniquities, upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds, we are healed. We are healed with his wounds. This can't be the Jewish people are healed by the wounds of the Jewish people. This sufferer is innocent, and he's suffering for people who are not. His death, in short, was an atonement. And the concept is a Jewish concept. I don't have to use the Christian version of that to bring that in. His death was an atonement that brings us peace for our guilt. And it involved his being pierced. Subpoint. Crucifixion was not known in the times that Isaiah, I think, was writing. It's a Phoenician torture method that comes along later. Historically, Martin Hengel's got a book on crucifixion if you want to read all about it. It's short and it's brutal. It's not easy reading because he doesn't try to make it sound nice. It's really hard to read. Verse 6, all we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Can this be the Jewish people on whom the iniquity is being laid? Hello? No. But you'll try to say that if, like John Loftus, you're open to anything except prophecy. It's specifically our sins, not his own, for which he suffered. Again, a vivid description of atonement. So I think the modern Jewish interpretation is dead several different ways by now. But there's more. Let's keep going. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Do you remember how Christ bore the treatment he received? How at both of his trials, before Pilate and before Herod Antipas, he refused to speak out in his defense, which astonished his judges. By oppression and judgment, he was taken away. And as for his generation, Who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? By oppression and judgment. He's not just killed. It's not mob violence. It's not an accident. He had a judicial trial and was unjustly condemned. This is Isaiah. It says, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. This is not some Christian coming along later. The Jews are our librarians. They have held these scriptures in their hands. We have an Isaiah scroll from before the time that Christianity even appeared upon the face of the planet. Virtually none of his contemporaries understood the real meaning of his death. Who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? Who got that bit? Again, no possible way that this can be the nation of Israel. Israel is not an innocent victim suffering for the transgression of Israel. Verse 9. I'm going verse by verse by verse. I am not skipping anything here. I'm not putting any ellipses into the quotations. These are the full verses. I'm taking them out of the English Standard Version, the ESV, if you want to know, because it's a good, modern, relatively literal translation. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. If I were trying to make up a story about that, and I had that prophecy, I'd make the rich guy the wicked guy. That would be cool, right? That would fit with the statements about how hard it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven and all that. That would be the way I would try to put it together. Not the way it goes down in the Gospels. No. In the Gospels, there's this really weird twist where he's appointed to die with two thieves, and you would expect then he'd be buried with them, but strange contrast to his manner of death. He's honorably buried in a rich man's tomb. Oh, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. What does Pilate say? From the very beginning of the trial, I find no guilt in this man. He's done nothing worthy of death. I usually release somebody to you. You want me to just release him to you? Then you guys can just take care of it, because this isn't really something I should get mixed up in. He had done no violence. There was no deceit in his mouth. They couldn't pin a lie on him. They couldn't make any charge of insurrection stick. This is not a guy who was hanging out in the desert with 400 men hoping to overthrow Rome. Note something. This is important because we're about to see a big twist here. At this point, he's dead. Definitely, unambiguously, he's dead. Keep hold of that point. And remember what I said about paradoxes that come clear only after the fact. He's dead, and he's buried in a grave. The very next verse, I'm not skipping anything here. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. Okay. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. What? What is that? What's going on? Somehow, after he's dead, the servant will not only see his offspring. What does that mean? Does that mean like physical children? No. He obtains them by his death. Offspring and children is a term that Isaiah uses for a people who either follow or don't follow the path that they're supposed to. Jesus in Mark 10 and John 21 speaks of his followers and specifically of his disciples as children. Children, have you caught anything? He says on the shore of the Sea of Galilee after the resurrection when they're out there fishing and it's coming toward dawn. But he's also going to prolong his days. Next verse. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. Notice something. It's not the anguish of his body. It's the anguish of his soul. Why? What does that mean? By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. How many of you think this is all just sort of chance? I mean, hey, it sounds vaguely like Jesus, but like a lot of other people too, like Socrates. Not even close. Go ahead. Do this as an exercise. It'll do you good. Search through all of history, not just Jewish history, all of history, and try to find somebody who meets half of these descriptions half as well as Jesus of Nazareth. Knock yourself out. It's the anguish of his soul, not just of his body, out of which his satisfaction comes. Does it call to your mind the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane? Where, by the way, this passage in Isaiah is not mentioned at all. Here again, we see the doctrine of the atonement standing out so clearly. By the way, if you have a doctrinal disagreement with somebody who doesn't think that Jesus died as an atonement, this would be a great place to go. Go here. Verse 12. Last verse of this passage. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for transgressors. So he's going to be triumphant. Though his sufferings were of some duration, he poured out his soul to death. That does not sound like a swift execution. John the Baptist was beheaded. This doesn't sound like that kind of a thing. It suggests a lingering death. What do you think that might be? And his judgment, a dishonorable one, yet he makes intercession for those who really are transgressors. What does Jesus say from the cross? Father, what? Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Let's summarize this one. The skeptical worries. The specific correspondence between the prophecy and the life of Jesus is indisputable. In fact, if you take a modern translation of this passage of Isaiah and you just write it out, you don't put verse numbers in it, you don't head it. This is from Isaiah, a prophet in the Old Testament. You just write it out on a page with no other information and you hand it to somebody who is not religious and you say, who's that? Almost inevitably they will say, well, that's a description of Jesus. It's probably from the Bible somewhere. Yeah, you're right. Know when it was written? So we don't have a worry here about it being too sketchy a correspondence to be worth much. Many aspects of this passage are so perplexing that it's very difficult, except after the fact, to see how they could be reconciled. He's made his grave with the wicked and with the rich. He shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days. The pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. What? How did that all fit together? What was that? The passage was translated by the Jews into Greek in the 3rd century BC, and they had it in Hebrew before. It lay beyond the power of any Christian to forge it after the facts. And by the way, the Jews were not going to rewrite this one in a way that made it seem a lot more like Jesus. That was not the way they rolled. The suggestion that Jesus acted a part in order to give his disciples a martyrdom and an apparent fulfilled prophecy is just flat out ridiculous. Hey, I got an idea. Let's make a plan to get myself killed in some really unpleasant way. That'll be really cool. That'll be awesome. Not going to happen. And yet, skeptics have been so troubled by the correspondences between the life of Jesus and this undeniably very early prophecy that Bolingbroke, who is an 18th century skeptical writer, actually tried to say, well, maybe he did fake it. That one didn't get very far with his contemporaries. That modern Jewish interpretation, several points in the passage cannot possibly be reconciled with the idea that the servant is Israel. We've already seen that. Not much earlier, Isaiah has used the term servant as a term in contrast to Jacob and Israel. Jacob, the name, is also used, as is Ephraim and other names, as a sort of group name for the people of Israel. But just a little bit before, in Isaiah 49, it's been used in a way that contrasts Israel with the servant. It's also applied to the Messiah as an individual, not to the nation of Israel, by other prophets. There are some passages in Ezekiel and Zechariah, if you want them. And I can send anybody the slides afterwards, too. So if you want all these references, I know it's a lot. So let's sum it up. All these minute details attending the death of the Messiah are found in a passage that's just 15 verses long, many centuries old by the time Jesus was born, kept in the hands of adversaries of Christianity who cannot be suspected of altering it to make it correspond more closely to the facts of his death. You may make up your own mind regarding John Loftus's contemptuous dismissal of the argument from this passage. Or you could just try to find somebody else who fits it. Knock yourself out. I warn you, though, if you're skeptically inclined and you're going to try, you're on dangerous ground, because after a few months of searching with complete failure to find anybody who lines up with it, you may be dangerously close to becoming a Christian. Give it a shot. I can do the same thing with Psalm 22, but I'm not going to quote every bit of the psalm. If you have a Bible, please open it at this point. If you have it on your phone, pull up Psalm 22. Is there anybody who is deprived of both paper and phone Bible and needs a Bible? I have an extra I can send out. Or you can look on with some nice person sitting near you. Phones are coming out everywhere. I feel like a dinosaur. I like paper. Okay. Psalm 22, verse by verse. Track with me as I go through it. All right? Get it open in front of you if you can. Number 1. Verse number 1. This person is forsaken by God. Or at least that's how he feels. Could be David, right? David writes Psalms. He had some rough times. That could be our man. Verse number 2, he's praying for deliverance during the previous night. Yeah, I'm sure lots of people pray during the night and then cry out to God the next day. Good. So far, nothing that looks like we have to call this prophecy. It's all just about somebody else, John Loftus tells you. But notice he doesn't reproach God for his sufferings. Verse 3. But he refers to our fathers in verse 4. So he's definitely a Jew. Hey, that could still be David. David's a Jew. He's been helped by God before. Still good. We're on for David. David's our man here. This is where we're going. He's exposed to the scorn and reproach of men and despised by the people. Actually, kind of a lot of the people loved David, but maybe it was from one of the hard times after one of his sons rebelled or something. Okay, we can still fit it into David. He's lifted up to die in public so that those who passed by could see him and mocked him. No, not David. Now we have to get a little bit more extreme. Maybe that's just a metaphor about how he was feeling that day. Really bad day. Like I might say, oh, there's this terrible scene in class and my teacher just crucified me. And it was all just a metaphor. Didn't mean it. Not literal. Now this is beginning to sound a little dodgy. Verse 8, he's mocked by people who say he trusted the Lord. That's got to be Jews who are mocking him. Hence he's put to death among his own nation, who, ironically, said that the sufferer claimed that God delighted in him. Oh no, we're beginning to think of somebody else this sounds like. Push that thought aside. It can't be anybody but David, right? It can't be anybody else. And God had always watched over him and saved him in infancy. What? Hello? David? Not so much. oh no, our David theory is going down. This isn't looking good. And his whole life had been dedicated to God so that he could say that God had been his God even from birth. Okay, maybe we could just accommodate that one. He's been like a really good guy, really righteous. Okay. He's abandoned by those who might have helped him. He's getting chased around by Saul, but he's got his own band of men with him most of the time. There's always some people who are with David. Even when he's like running from Absalom, he's got his own troops. But maybe that just means some people had abandoned him. But he's surrounded by his enemies. He describes them as bulls of Bashan. If you look up Amos 4:1, that doesn't mean he's surrounded by oxen, literally. It's a metaphor for enemies, especially enemies who don't fear God, who continually insult him, gaping in contempt. That's what the word literally denotes, is a contemptuous kind of stare. Job 16 gives us an example of it. Ravening and roaring. What did the crowd say when Pilate's like, I find no fault in this man? What was the response of the crowd gathered in the courtyard, picked by the Jewish leaders to come with them and whipped into a frenzy? What do they say? Crucify him! His blood be on us and our children! Okay, all right. I'd say ravening and roaring could refer to that. When was David continually insulted by his enemy? I mean, when he was really most nearly abandoned, he was in hiding. It was precisely not the fact that his enemies were all around him. His side pierced, his bones out of joint, suggesting that he is suspended by crucifixion. Not David, anywhere at all. The David theory should be dead by now. His suffering extreme weakness and thirst before his death. Yeah. Can you see why this psalm has been called the Psalm of Crucifixion? His hands and his feet pierced. But by whom? He's put to death among his own people, but the men who do this are called dogs. How does Jesus use the phrase dogs? It's a typical Jewish usage. Syrophoenician woman comes and asks him to heal her daughter, I think it is. And what does he say to her? Tests her a little bit. It's not right for me to take meat from the children's table and throw it to the dogs. What does that mean? Does this mean puppies? No, it means people who aren't Jews, like you. And she responds humbly and still in trust. And he says, your faith is great. And he heals her daughter that very moment. But dogs is a term for people who are not Jews. But he's being put to death among people who say he trusted in the Lord. So they're Jews. How is it that dogs are doing this? Who crucifies Jesus? Roman soldiers. 4 of them probably. A quaternion, a set of 4, was a typical unit that the military would use to go carry out a job. Hands and feet pierced. His body exposed, stretched out so that his bones stood out where they stood watching him. Not David. Maybe somebody else. They divide his garments among them, but they cast lots for his vesture. If you're dividing his garments, why don't you just give one to this guy, one to this guy, one to that guy, one to the other guy, and be done with it? Why would you cast lots? Just divvy it up. One guy gets the socks, one guy gets the shoes. Why not do it this way? Only the event provides us with a key to that and unlocks that for us. Jesus' tunic was woven in a single piece. The only way to divide it in 4 would be to destroy it. There's a short prayer in verse 19. I'm not going to try to press that into service in any particular way as part of the prophecy, but then we pick right up in verse 20. What does the term sword mean? Oh, maybe this is a disanalogy. Maybe it means this person is killed by the sword. Actually, if you read around in the Old Testament, it denotes any kind of a violent death. Being put to the sword is a metaphor for being killed. violently, not just dying in bed of old age. Despite his troubles, though, and despite even his death, he feels sure of deliverance. Bart Ehrman tried to say in one of his books that Jesus in Mark, which he thinks is the first gospel written, could be right, doesn't know what's happening to him and is completely baffled as to why he's being killed. And he says that's a literary choice on Mark's part to portray him that way, whereas in Luke he's very confident, he knows exactly what's happening. Does anybody remember what Jesus tells his disciples in Mark 8:31? Or in Mark 9:31, or in Mark 10:32 through 34, or in other places. He's perpetually telling them, now, the Son of Man has to go to Jerusalem, and he's going to be delivered over to the chief priests, they're going to crucify him, and the third day he's going to rise again. Over and over and over and over and over he's saying this. Does that sound like somebody who doesn't know what's happening? No, it doesn't sound like somebody who doesn't know what's happening. He knows exactly what's happening. So, here in the psalm, whoever this is talking about, despite his troubles, he feels sure of deliverance. He's to be restored to life and freedom. He declares God's name to his brethren. That would be Jews. But his deliverance, we are so far beyond David here, it's silly. His deliverance is of worldwide significance. Great blessings follow from it, beginning with those who praise God. Starts with the people who praise God. Those are Jews, but the significance goes beyond that. I'm sorry, I'm just beginning to laugh inwardly at the idea that this is David. The blessings are somehow connected with God's not having despised, but rather accepted his sufferings, verse 24. They include a reference to certain vows. I don't know what that means. It's okay. I don't have to have an answer for the exact meaning of every single bit of this. It doesn't have to mean anything that couldn't line up with the story of Jesus. Nothing comes to mind. Maybe I'll search around and I'll find something next week. Maybe I won't. That's all right. I'm not going to press it if I can't see it. And to a wonderful feast. We do have a clue what the feast might be. The early Christians celebrated it every week on Sunday. The blessings extend even to the Gentile nations and to the most distant parts of the world, because those parts of the world are now to become worshippers of the true God. Has that happened in parts of the world very remote from Palestine, do you think? Or do you still think this is just David? Jehovah is that true God. He's the one to whom the world rightly belongs. So this is not going to be disconnected from the worship of Jehovah. It's going to be continuous with it. And Jehovah is the one to whom everyone will eventually bow. A seed will serve him. Again, remember Isaiah 1:4 and other passages where this idea of children or seed or offspring is used for followers, either people who do follow like they're supposed to, or people who should have been followers and fail. Generation after generation. And what are they going to tell of? They're going to tell of his wonderful deliverance. This has been an amazing deliverance. And that will continue to generations unborn. That's one of the pieces of Messianic prophecy. Make up your own mind. See what you think is going on there. Do you think that it's not a close enough match, really, to carry much weight? Do you think that this might have been written after the events? It's in the Psalms. The Jews have been keeping watch over their Psalms for 1,000 years by the time Christianity gets started. Do you think if Christians had come along and rewritten that or inserted a psalm in there that the Jews would just stand by quietly and say, oh, you discovered a new psalm. Oh, well, that's nice. No, I don't think so. Is this the kind of thing that somebody could sort of fit his own life into? Trick the rest of us, act the part? How are you going to make that happen? How are you going to make that happen so that generation after generation after generation tells of the wonder of this deliverance? Has that happened? Not if it was David. So you see the importance of our paying attention to the pattern of prophecy and not just to this verse ripped out of its context or that verse ripped out of its context. You need to see the whole thing in perspective, and when you do, you realize why the earliest Christians found the prophecies of the Messiah solved, the paradoxes unlocked by the life of someone that they had known.